I'm making another album, and now I'm back on the horse, working on it again, and I have my new deadline of April the 14th firmly in my sights. It struck me that making this album is so much easier than the second album I ever made, which was called Songs Without Words, and I made it in 2008. And I thought it would be interesting and useful for both me and you to actually have a look at why that might be. Why, when many of the conditions that you would think would lead to a much better album and it would be a much easier process, led to it being much more difficult. And how now I'm able to do this relatively easily compared to back then. My second album, Songs Without Words, came about because Ohm Records in San Francisco signed me off the back of my previous one, which was the first album I made, which was called Smorgasbord. So one of the things I did have with Songs Without Words was money. They actually gave me an advance. It was probably one of the last times they gave, I don't know, but it was definitely at the end of the period when people got advances for albums, particularly on independent labels. But I got a fairly sizable chunk of cash, with which I bought some new speakers and a synth. It was a Dave Smith Polyevolver and a couple of Adam S something or others. And I had some money to live off. So I didn't do any gigs for a while, and that's all I was doing. I was just making the album. So I had plenty of time. I had all of the time in the world, really. I had all of the time that was possible to have, as much time as I wanted. I had a separate studio space as well. So I had the studio, I had the equipment, I had a little bit of money. It wasn't loads, but it was enough to live on, and I had time. The other thing that I had was other people, because I had a label. But unfortunately, that label were in San Francisco and I was in London. So I wasn't around them. I wasn't talking to them constantly. And I remember early on in the album process, they wouldn't give me a deadline. I'm not sure that I specifically asked for one, but they wanted to give me as much space and time as I needed. And I think because I had loads of time, this led to a terrible situation in terms of my creativity. I had none of the limitations around me that meant that I had to make it happen. I had none of the forcing functions. I didn't have a deadline. I didn't have an endpoint. I didn't have a limited amount of time. Whereas now, making this album, I do have a deadline. Yes, it is flexible in that I had to push it back because of life happening. So I had to push it into the future by a couple of weeks. So it's flexible in that sense, but now it is set again. So I have a specific deadline that I have to complete by, and I've got other people involved, i.e. you, so I've just told you about it. And also with my Make an Album with Mike people, they know what's going on too. So this is a deadline, and I have a very limited amount of time to do it in because I'm doing other things. I'm not doing it full time. I'm also using the minimum amount of equipment and gear that I possibly can. And this leads me on to some of the other things that I didn't have when I was making Songs Without Words. So there I was in my studio space. It was another converted shed in the garden, but it had brick walls, so it was soundproofed, unlike this one. So I actually had a much better ideal setup to record stuff. But if I think about my external goal, right, the goal for my album, it was actually very vague. I wanted to become a big artist. Stroke DJ. That was my goal. Bringing it back to mind now, I can remember kind of thinking, oh, it's great. I've got these people behind me. They'll be able to push me and I'll just be able to focus on the music and travel around the world DJing. It's just going to be great, right? So I had this very vague goal that I thought this album could get me. And then what I wanted to get out of the album as an artist, how I wanted to grow. Well, I remember having the name Songs Without Words very early on, which is an interesting name given what I'm doing now, because you can hear within it, I wanted to write songs, but I didn't want to sing. Now, back then, I remember having this justification saying, Well, I really want to write instrumental music that is as catchy, that has the storytelling that you can have in a song. I didn't want to make music that was as faceless or as functional as a lot of the instrumental music that I had made. I didn't want to be just another DJ. And that's not to say that all DJs are faceless and functional. That's not what I'm saying at all. But for me, I wanted to do something that was had more personality, more purpose. In fact, I wanted to do something that had a unique thing to it. And I wanted to see what I could do in instrumental music, because I remember saying a number of times around then that the wonderful thing about instrumental music is it allows other people to have their own experience, and that lyrics can define exactly what the purpose of a track is. Of course, now I'm writing lyrics, I realize that you can write lyrics that have multiple different meanings, but which also mean something to you as well. But back then, that was my justification. But honestly, if I look back in hindsight, and I hope I'm not backwards rewriting history, I don't think I am. But if I look back, to be honest, I'd always wanted to be a singer. From the very earliest age, I wanted to sing songs. And somewhere along the way, I became extremely afraid of using my voice and singing. If you want to listen to the episode of that story of how I kind of became afraid of singing, I'll put a link in the show notes to exactly where you can listen to that episode. It's one of the earliest album episodes from quite a long time ago. So this album, Songs Without Words, which I had from very early on as a name, the idea of it was I want to write songs, but I'm too afraid to sing them. Right? So I'm too afraid to sing. So in a sense, that growth goal, I think, was probably not a very good one, because what I was doing with it was I was trying to avoid the thing that I really needed to do, which was to sing and write actual songs. So in terms of the reasons why I was doing this, I had a vague external goal and not a very useful growth goal. Whereas now what I have is a very clear growth goal. I want to become a much better singer and songwriter as quickly as possible by keeping the production as simple as possible. Now, whether I do that or not is another matter, but that is my growth goal with this album that I'm writing now. My external goal is much clearer. I want to launch an entirely new artist name by releasing the album as singles, yes, not as a whole album, releasing it, one by one in an episodic fashion. And I want to start attracting an audience with these releases so that I can start building an entirely new artist business. So that's a very clear external goal. On top of that, I also know what the function of the album is, or at least the main function of the album. And the main function of this album is to demonstrate many of the things that I'm teaching in Make an Album with Mike, that I'm coaching people through in Make an Album with Mike. I didn't have one of those in Songs Without Words. But the most important thing that this album has, that Songs Without Words didn't, this album has a very clear purpose. In other words, it is expressing a specific story. Now, not every album has to express a specific story. That's not what a purpose has to be. I like, at this point, writing albums which express a specific story that as a whole, it's like a kind of novel. But even if it didn't have that, having a clear purpose of what this album represents, it could be a message, an idea, or even a collection of songs which express different things. Each individual track has a specific purpose which allow me to make it. I'm not just focused on the external goal. I'm not just focused on the function. I'm not just focused on the growth. All of these 4 different whys for this album are helping me make decisions. As you'll notice in your own creative process, very often you'll be in a situation where you're like, well, why this and not that? Or I don't have any idea. I don't know how to move this forward. The reason you don't know how to move this forward is because you're relying on your feelings, because you're relying on your feelings about the music. How do I make this better? This doesn't feel right. Well, there's no way of knowing, apart from randomly throwing stuff at a wall, there's no way of knowing how to improve it without having some kind of structure around why you're doing it. And now it might be a good time to talk about why I would count Songs Without Words as a failure. Well, number one, it took me a very long time to write. I mean, full time I was doing it, and I think it took me around a year-ish. I'm not exactly sure. It's hard to say. It's hard to remember. But I don't know, 8-9 months to a year to make full time in the studio. And the album itself, I don't think works as an album. I don't think it is an album. I think it's a collection of tracks, some of which I think are good and some of which I think are terrible. So it's not a good album. As an album, it simply doesn't work. And it didn't do any of the things that I wanted it to. You know, the vague goal, it didn't hit the vague goal. In fact, after the album, after a little while, I got dropped by Ohm anyway. And it killed me to make it. It was like getting blood out of a stone. And I do think it showed. So that's why I would describe that album as a failure, and why I'm using it as an example of what not to do, right? Loads of time, loads of equipment, no deadlines, no limitations, doing it all on my own with no people around me. It just didn't work. Now, of course, it remains to be seen whether this album is going to be any good, whether it fulfills the whys. Having said that, I am already a much better singer-songwriter than I was at the start of the album. I know that for a fact. I know it is demonstrating the principles of Make an Album with Mike, because I've been using the making of the album to design different exercises and games and musical games. And it is telling a story. It's already doing that. Whether the external goal is reached or not will be dependent on what happens when I start releasing it. So we'll see about that. But certainly I feel much more confident that I'm going in the right direction with this album. I think one of the reasons for that is that I'm doing it in public, and the regular sessions where I'm talking to people about their albums, I'm talking to them about my album. We're basically sharing ideas and bouncing ideas off each other is making a huge difference to the insights I'm getting and keeping me on track, something that I didn't have in Songs Without Words. But I think the final thing to focus on is a mindset thing that I didn't have when I was making Songs Without Words. So back then in 2008, I think I still had, even though I'm not sure I knew it, I had a belief in talent. I had a belief that there was such a thing as perfection. I had a belief in fixed points. What I didn't have was the beliefs I have now, the assumptions that I have now, which is everything can always be improved. And that if there is a problem there in the music, then I can solve it. And solving it doesn't mean making it perfect, because everything can always be improved. So now I have this very strong belief around improvement, growth, and that being infinite. So at no point when I design a program, when I create a music game for one of my programs, no point in making the method that I use, the systematic method. Oh, and by the way, that was another thing I didn't have in 2008. Didn't have a systematic method for making music, which I absolutely do now. But this systematic method, for example, is not a fixed thing. It's an ongoing, developing, always improving thing, because I have this belief in endless improvement. Back then, in 2008, with the album, what I was trying to do was create pieces of music which were the best versions of themselves. That I was trying to reach this fixed point. Now I recognize what I'm doing by finishing these pieces of music on my current album is I am necessarily, in finishing them, saying I am not going to improve these anymore. That is what finishing pieces of music is. It's not saying I have made them perfect. It is saying I have decided that I am not going to improve them anymore, because that is the closest to reality. Of course, everything can always be improved. What are you saying to yourself by believing anything else? Are you saying to yourself that you know when something is perfect? I might kindly and gently say, isn't that a little bit arrogant? Right? Doesn't that, I mean, I'm talking about myself back then in 2008. I thought I would know when something was perfect and I would believe myself. That there's an enormous amount of pride and arrogance involved in that, which I no longer believe. I now know that at any given point, I am choosing to say this is finished because it needs to be finished, and that I am making a choice not to improve it anymore. So that belief in constant, infinite improvement, and that belief that I can find those improvements, but at some point have to say, no, I'm not going to anymore. Yeah. At some point, I have to deliver this workshop, right? So I'm going to deliver the best I can do now. At some point, I have to finish this album and say, this is what it is right now. This is a snapshot of where I'm at right now. This is as good as I could do right now. And then moving on to the next one. That is the fundamental thing that has changed since 2008. Back then, I was a terrible perfectionist. I had all the time in the world. I had money. I had the gear. I had an ideal recording situation, and it got me nowhere. So if you're currently struggling to finish music or finish an album, then it may well be that the things that you believe you need, or the things that you believe are what you want, are actually not serving you. If your experience is similar to mine or the many hundreds of people who I help, it may well be that what you think you need, you don't need. And those elements that you think are going to help you finish music are in fact going to lead you not very far. If you want to finish music or a project or finish an album, what I have noticed you need is, number one, other people involved. Other people to keep you on track and also to give you ideas. Other people to bounce ideas off. Not give you feedback, but other people to kind of get you out of your first person perspective so you can see the bigger picture. And throughout the album writing or the project finishing process, you need that. Number two, you need a deadline. Look, I don't think I still haven't thought of a single thing I have finished without some kind of deadline. That may well be true for you as well. Number three, you need a systematic method to finish music. You need to know what it is you're actually doing, and you need a clear idea of why you're doing it in 4 different areas. Why are you doing it for your growth? Why are you doing it for the listener? What's the function of it for the listener? And what is your external goal for this project you're finishing? But most crucially, why are you doing it for the music? What is the purpose of the music you are making? What is that music expressing? And if you believe you need more gear, or you need more money, or you need more time, please remember my experience of making the worst album that I ever made, Songs Without Words. More money, more time, more gear doesn't equal better music. So with all that said, I'm going to stop talking about making an album and start making one.